A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
I was looking at a satellite feed of the Persian Gulf yesterday, specifically the imagery from March 20th, 2026, and it is incredible how one tiny speck of coral can basically hold the entire Iranian economy together. Today's prompt from Daniel is about Kharg Island, its history, and why it has become the ultimate strategic target in the current conflict. We are talking about a piece of land that is roughly 3 miles wide and 5 miles long, yet it handles over 90% of Iran's crude oil exports. If you want to understand why the coalition strikes earlier this month were so surgical, you have to understand the geography of this island. It is the definition of a high-stakes bottleneck.
Herman Poppleberry here, and I have been diving into the terminal maps and bathymetric charts all morning. Kharg is fascinating because it is not just a port, it is a geological anomaly that makes the Iranian oil industry possible. Most of the Iranian coastline in the Gulf is relatively shallow, especially as you move north toward the Shatt al-Arab Delta, where silt buildup makes it a nightmare for massive tankers. But Kharg sits about 15 miles off the coast and is surrounded by naturally deep water. That depth allows very large crude carriers, or VLCCs, to dock and load directly. Without Kharg, Iran would be forced to use much smaller ships and incredibly inefficient ship-to-ship transfers in the middle of the Gulf, which would cut their export efficiency by a massive margin. It is the single point of failure that keeps the IRGC funded.
It is the jugular vein. If you pinch it, the whole system deoxygenates. But it is not a new realization for the Iranians. They have known this since the 1950s, when the International Consortium first started developing the terminal. I am curious about the transition from a purely commercial asset to this fortress-like military node. It seems like the island has basically been under siege, or at least in a state of high alert, for the better part of 40 years. How did it go from a standard industrial site to what we see today, which is essentially a stationary aircraft carrier made of oil tanks?
That is a direct result of the tanker war in the 1980s. During the Iran-Iraq conflict, Saddam Hussein realized early on that he could not win a ground war of attrition against Iran's larger population, so he went after the money. Iraq flew over 400 raids against Kharg Island using French-built Super Attended jets and Exocet missiles. They hit the jetties, the storage tanks, and the tankers themselves. What is wild is that despite the constant bombardment, the Iranians never stopped exporting for long. They became masters of rapid repair. They would have engineering teams living in bunkers, ready to weld pipes back together before the smoke from an explosion even cleared. That experience defined their entire defensive doctrine for the next 4 decades. They learned that you do not need to make the island invulnerable, you just need to make it repairable.
So, the resilience we are seeing now, even after the coalition strikes this March, is not an accident. It is a muscle they have been training since 1984. But the technology has changed. Back then, you were dealing with relatively dumb bombs or early-generation cruise missiles with limited accuracy. Today, we are looking at stealth platforms and precision munitions that can pick a specific valve on a manifold from 50 miles away. How does the physical engineering of the island actually hold up against that? You mentioned the T-Jetty and the Sea Island terminal earlier. What is the difference between those two in terms of vulnerability?
The T-Jetty is on the east side of the island, facing the Iranian mainland. It is about 4,000 feet long and can handle about 10 tankers at once, but they are usually smaller vessels or coastal tankers. It is somewhat protected by the island's mass from the open Gulf. The real prize, and the real vulnerability, is the Sea Island terminal on the west side. That is a massive deep-water structure that can accommodate the 300,000 deadweight ton giants. The problem for Iran is that these are static, massive, industrial targets. You cannot hide a jetty that is nearly a mile long. The sea island is especially vulnerable because it is out in the open water, connected to the island by submarine pipelines. In the strikes earlier this March, which we talked about in episode 1009, the coalition did not even have to hit the storage tanks. They targeted the pumping stations and the manifold headers. If the oil cannot get from the tanks to the ships, the tanks might as well be empty.
It is the difference between blowing up a gas station and just breaking the handle on the pump. You still have the fuel, but you cannot get it into the car. I noticed that in the reports from this month, there was a lot of emphasis on minimizing environmental damage. If you blow up a storage tank with 1,000,000 barrels of crude, you create an ecological disaster that stays in the Gulf for decades, affecting every nation on the coast. By hitting the pumping infrastructure, you achieve the economic goal of financial decapitation without the environmental blowback. But Herman, Iran has put a massive amount of hardware on that island to prevent exactly that. We are talking about some of the densest air defense in the region, right?
They have layered it heavily. Kharg is protected by an integrated air defense system that includes Russian-made S-300 batteries and their indigenous Tor M1 clones. They have also moved a lot of their point defense systems, like the Kordad 15 and the Bavar 373, onto the island to catch low-flying cruise missiles. But there is a technical limitation here that most people overlook. The island is small. Radar interference from the massive metal oil tanks and the industrial machinery creates incredible amounts of clutter. Plus, because it is an island, an attacker can approach from 360 degrees at very low altitudes over the water to stay under the radar horizon until the last possible second. It is the classic problem of trying to defend a lighthouse. You can see everything coming, but there is nowhere to hide the light.
It sounds like a defender's nightmare despite the concentration of weapons. You have no terrain to hide behind, and your own infrastructure is working against your sensors. I want to go back to the historical context for a second because it explains their current plan B. During the tanker war, when Kharg was getting hammered, Iran started a shuttle tanker system. They would use smaller ships to move oil from Kharg to Siri Island or Larak Island further south, out of range of Iraqi jets. Is that what we are seeing with the Jask pipeline project? Is that their modern version of the shuttle system?
It is the ultimate evolution of that idea, but with a much higher price tag. The Jask pipeline is a 1,000-kilometer project designed to bypass the Strait of Hormuz entirely. It takes oil from the fields in the southwest and pipes it all the way to Jask on the Gulf of Oman. The idea was to make Kharg Island optional. If the island is neutralized, they can still export from Jask. However, the capacity is the issue. Kharg can move several million barrels a day. Jask, even with recent upgrades, is nowhere near that. Plus, the recent coalition strikes showed that the pumping stations along the pipeline are just as vulnerable as the jetties on the island. You are just trading one static target for a series of smaller ones spread across a vast desert. It is decentralization, but it is not necessarily security.
And those smaller targets are spread out over 1,000 kilometers of desert. That seems like an even bigger headache to defend. If you are the IRGC, you are looking at this and realizing that the era of strategic depth is kind of over when your enemy has satellite coverage that can track a truck in real time. We actually discussed the shift to underground production in episode 1397, but you cannot put an oil terminal underground. You eventually have to come to the surface to put the oil on a ship. The physics of fluid dynamics and maritime logistics are the ultimate constraints on their secrecy.
That is the fundamental bottleneck of the entire Iranian state. They have spent billions on their missile program, which we covered in episode 918, to create a deterrent that says, if you hit our oil, we hit your cities. But that deterrent only works if the other side is afraid of the escalation. What we saw this month was a calculated bet by the coalition that they could hit the economic nodes without triggering a full-scale ballistic war. By focusing on the pumps and pipes rather than the tanks and people, they lowered the escalatory pressure while still gutting the IRGC's primary source of revenue. It is a very sophisticated form of economic warfare that relies on knowing exactly which bolt to unscrew to make the whole machine stop.
It is a fascinating shift in doctrine. We used to talk about shock and awe, where you hit everything at once. Now it is surgical strangulation. I am looking at some shipping data from last week, and it is clear that the dark fleet of tankers that Iran uses to bypass sanctions is effectively paralyzed. They are sitting off the coast of Kharg, waiting for loading operations that are not happening because the manifold controls are fried. Herman, if you were an analyst looking at satellite imagery of Kharg today, what would be the canary in the coal mine for a recovery? How do we know when they have bypassed the damage?
I would look at the flare stacks first. On any major oil terminal, you see those constant flames where they are burning off excess gas. If those go dark, the entire flow has stopped. But more specifically, I would watch the crane activity on the T-jetty. Iran is very good at jury-rigging solutions. If they start bringing in modular pumping units on barges to bypass the destroyed permanent stations, they could resume low-volume exports within weeks. They are not going to wait for the high-tech replacement parts that they cannot get because of sanctions. They will try to build a steampunk version of an oil terminal using whatever valves and pipes they have in storage. It will be dangerous, inefficient, and prone to leaks, but they will try it.
Steampunk oil exports. That is a mental image. But that brings up a good point about the second-order effects. If they move to these jury-rigged systems, the risk of a massive spill goes up exponentially. You are using old pipes, manual overrides, and bypasses that were never meant for long-term use. The coalition's clean strike could end up causing an environmental disaster anyway, just because the Iranian repair efforts are so desperate. Is there any international oversight for this, or is the island essentially a black hole for environmental regulation right now?
It is a total black hole. The Persian Gulf is a relatively closed system. A major leak at Kharg would circulate and hit the desalination plants in Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and the Emirates. It is an economic weapon in itself. Iran has actually hinted at this in their rhetoric, basically saying that if they cannot export their oil safely, then nobody in the Gulf will have clean water. It is a grim form of mutual assured destruction that does not involve nuclear weapons. They are holding the ecology of the Gulf hostage to protect their export capacity.
It really highlights why the Jask pipeline was such a priority for them, even if it is not a full replacement. It gives them a release valve. But even there, you run into the problem of the VLCCs. Jask does not have the same natural deepwater harbor that Kharg has. They have to use single-point mooring buoys, which are basically giant floating plugs out at sea connected to the shore by flexible hoses. Those are even easier to disable than a jetty. You just send a small underwater drone to clip the hoses, and the whole operation is done for months. There is no such thing as a secure oil export in a modern conflict zone.
The technical vulnerability of the global energy supply chain is honestly terrifying when you look at it through this lens. We think of these things as massive, immovable pillars of power, but they are actually very delicate machines. Kharg Island is the perfect example. It is a fortress, a piggy bank, and a target all at once. The history of the island is basically the history of modern Iran, starting with international cooperation in the 50s, moving to revolutionary defiance in the 70s, and ending up in this state of high-tech siege in 2026.
Let us talk about the economic impact of financial decapitation for a minute. We know the IRGC uses the oil revenue from Kharg to fund their operations across the Middle East. If Kharg is operating at, say, 20% capacity because of the recent strikes, what does that do to their ability to maintain their proxies? We are already seeing reports of budget cuts for Hezbollah and some of the militias in Iraq. Is the link between the Kharg pumping stations and the regional conflict really that direct?
It is almost a one-to-one correlation. The lag time is usually about 3 to 6 months. They have cash reserves and black market channels, but the scale of Kharg's exports is so large that you cannot replace it with suitcases of cash or small-scale smuggling. The IRGC operates like a massive corporate conglomerate. They have payrolls for tens of thousands of fighters, procurement contracts for missile components, and social service obligations in the areas they control. When the oil stops flowing at Kharg, the oil for influence model starts to collapse. In episode 1009, we talked about how this was a strategic shift in coalition policy, moving away from fighting the proxies on the ground and toward cutting off the bank account at the source.
It is a much more efficient way to wage a conflict if you have the stomach for the economic volatility. But for the average Iranian, this is devastating. The rial is already in freefall. If the state's primary source of hard currency vanishes, you get hyperinflation that makes the current situation look like the good old days. It creates a different kind of pressure on the regime, not from the coalition, but from their own population. Herman, What is one thing about Kharg that most people get wrong? I think there is a misconception that it is just a bunch of oil tanks and soldiers.
Most people do not realize that the island is a living community. There is a town there, also called Kharg, where the terminal workers and their families live. There are schools, hospitals, and even ancient archaeological sites, including a Sassanid-era church and a famous Achaemenid inscription. When we talk about striking Kharg Island, we are talking about a place with thousands of civilians. The Iranians deliberately co-locate military assets near the civilian infrastructure to make targeting more difficult. It is the human shield strategy applied to industrial geography. They know that a coalition pilot is going to hesitate to drop a bomb if the blast radius includes a primary school.
That adds a whole other layer of complexity to the coalition's mission planning. You are trying to hit a manifold header that is maybe 200 yards away from a housing complex for terminal workers. The precision required is insane. It explains why they are using specific low-yield munitions that collapse the pipes without sending shrapnel 3 miles in every direction. It is a surgical operation in the truest sense of the word.
The engineering of the strikes is just as impressive as the engineering of the terminal itself. They are using kinetic shaping to ensure that the damage is localized. For example, if you hit a specific junction on the pipeline that feeds the sea island, you can stop the flow to the tankers without ever touching the main storage farm. The goal is to make the terminal non-functional rather than destroyed. You want to leave them with something they have to spend all their time and money trying to fix, which is a secondary form of economic drain. It is the sunk cost fallacy as a military strategy.
Like giving someone a car that breaks down every 5 miles. They spend more on the mechanic than they would on a new car, but they cannot afford a new car. It is a cycle of exhaustion. So, where does this go from here? Does Kharg remain the center of this story, or do we see a permanent shift toward the Gulf of Oman and land-based exports? Is the era of the giant island terminal over?
Kharg will always be the center because of that deep water. You cannot replicate that geography overnight. Even if they build 10 more Jask pipelines, the efficiency of loading a VLCC at a dedicated deep-water terminal is just too high to abandon. What I think we will see is an attempt by Iran to harden the island even further, maybe moving more of the critical pumping infrastructure into tunnels or reinforced concrete bunkers. But again, you are fighting the physics of oil. You cannot pump millions of barrels a day through a tiny hidden straw. You need big pipes, big pumps, and big targets.
It is the industrial footprint problem. You can hide a missile launcher in a cave, but you cannot hide an oil terminal. For our listeners who want to keep an eye on this, I highly recommend looking at open-source maritime tracking sites. You can see the tanker traffic jams developing in real time. When you see 20 VLCCs idling in the Gulf of Oman, instead of moving toward Kharg, you know the terminal is down. It is one of the few areas of modern warfare where the battle damage assessment is basically public information, if you know where to look.
I would also keep an eye on the Dark Fleet transponders. A lot of these tankers turn off their automatic identification systems, or AIS, when they enter Iranian waters to hide their location. But you can still see them on synthetic aperture radar satellite feeds, which can see through clouds and smoke. There are some great analysts on social media who specialize in this kind of tanker tracking. It is a window into the shadow economy that funds the IRGC. If you see the Dark Fleet moving toward Jask instead of Kharg, you know the strategic shift is becoming permanent.
This has been a fascinating look at how a tiny island can become the center of a global geopolitical storm. It is a mix of ancient history, unique geology, and very modern, very high-stakes military strategy. It is not just about oil. It is about the survival of a regime versus the precision of modern warfare. The fact that we are talking about Sassanid ruins and S-300 missiles in the same breath tells you everything you need to know about the complexity of this region.
And it is a reminder that in the 21st century, geography still matters. You can have all the digital influence and cyber capabilities in the world, but if you cannot protect the one spot where your oil meets the deep water, your economy is at the mercy of whoever controls the skies. Kharg Island is a relic of the 20th century oil boom that has been forced to survive in a 21st century conflict environment.
Well, I think we have covered the jugular vein from every angle today. If you want to dive deeper into the military side of this, check out episode 918 on Iran's missile arsenal, or episode 1278, where we broke down their new ballistic warhead doctrine. Both give a lot of context on how they try to protect assets like Kharg.
And for the economic side, episode 1009 is the definitive guide to how the financial decapitation strategy actually works in practice. It is the perfect companion to this discussion. We also have a deep dive into the Jask pipeline engineering in episode 1142 if you want to see why that project is so difficult to complete.
We should probably wrap it up there. Thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flemingtop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes. And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power the research and generation of this show. We literally could not do these deep dives into satellite data without that compute.
This has been My Weird Props. If you are finding these episodes helpful or just enjoyed the deep dives, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really does help other people find the show and keeps us motivated to keep digging into these topics.
You can find us at myweirdprompts.com for the full archive and all the ways to subscribe. We will be back next time with another prompt from Daniel. Until then, keep asking the weird questions.
Goodbye, everyone.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show.